Welcome back. I'm Brad Littlejohn talking here with Dr. Alastair Roberts about how we as Christians can prudently and wisely navigate the challenges posed by the coronavirus pandemic and the related uncertainty and political questions that this is posed for the church. So in this last video, we want to get a little bit practical here, at least, and say um, how should churches respond? How can we learn from this? How can we be faithful disciples and witnesses in the midst of all of this uncertainty? And I think the first point we want to talk about here, following on from our last discussion, is the biggest thing that I think this virus has exposed has been the breakdown in networks of trust. And I really do think that the greater damage that we are already seeing, perhaps, and are going to see, greater than the health damage, greater than the economic damage, at least potentially greater, hopefully not greater, but potentially the greater damage is the damage that this is doing to our societies, our political structures, and to the relationships of trust between the governors and governed. So, and I do think it's very important that Christians be maintaining a strong public witness during this time and modeling what humility and wisdom looks like, instead of contributing to that breakdown of trust. So how can we go about recovering the trust that is needed to sustain wise public action, even in the midst of all the uncertainty that faces us, even in the midst of the fact that we are faced with lots of people who have an agenda, lots of unreliable media? Well, there are lots of reasons to be skeptics, to be cynics, and yet we cannot, as I said, we cannot just be the dwarves who would not be taken in. There's a time not to be taken in, and there is a time to open your eyes and accept the reality that's in front of you and act wisely in light of it.
So we need both trust and trustworthiness. There needs to be a meeting of these two things together. And unless the rulers are going to manifestly be trustworthy, it'd be very difficult for the people to trust them. And when in our sorts of situations that trust has broken down, there needs to be some sort of initiative, I think, particularly on the part of those who are governing, to restore that trust. Mm-hmm. And that is established through manifest concern for the good of the people who are being governed. It's established through the transparency, giving information and explaining as much as possible what's going on. And that's one of the reasons I've been concerned about the sort of disinformation around some issues that has been done for reasons of policy, but it doesn't necessarily conduce to a healthy environment of trust. What we need is a context where people can trust their leaders and recognize that they may make the wrong decisions, but they're making those decisions out of a concern for a common good that includes us. Beyond that, I think there needs to be consideration about mediating institutions, because most of us don't know experts in all of these areas. What we need are people who mediate between us and people who do have access to these experts. And there, I think, things like pastors and pastoral education are key, because when you would have a pastoral education where pastors are connected to a wider institution where there's many different forms of learning going on, you would have an exposure to the sort of reasoning, the manner of people arrive at certain judgments in these fields, and just a basic level of education in these areas that would enable you to, with the networks of friendships and other things that you have developed, to trust certain people who have expertise in areas that you don't. The more that we move in upon our own circles and limit ourselves to our own ideological camp, the more that we lose the ability to draw upon a wide network of counselors and advisors. And there, I think also the pastor is someone who mediates between the local authorities, mediates between government instructions and regulations, between local businesses and the congregation. And the more that we have pastors exercising their role within the community well, the more that congregations will feel, okay, we're in a safe pair of hands, and this person is coordinated with these other that we're more participating in this judgment. It's not being enforced upon us
Right.
from outside. It's something for our good, and we can act intelligently in terms of this, and we don't feel that it's an imposition to the same degree. We may not understand everything, but we understand that the people who are making these judgments are trustworthy people. I think we all experience this as kids. There are many judgments that our parents made on our behalf that we did not understand, but we knew our parents. And because we knew our parents, we could trust them to make judgments on things that were beyond our ability to make judgments upon. And
So,
so
sorry, jump in. Oh no, you finish up, and then I'll throw something in.
reestablishing those channels of trust will enable us to work in terms of a wiser framework than we'd have if we're just working in terms of whatever is within our ideological immediate vicinity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, but what it sounds like you're saying there is that it's really important for pastors to be serving as the kind of the conduit of that. The person, the pastor is the one who is connected to many different sources of knowledge and is able to weigh them and help his congregants think about it. Is that what you're saying? Because I worry that is putting too much of an unrealistic burden on the pastor of being someone who can sort through everything and distill it for his congregation. I mean, that's something you've said previously. We shouldn't have the idea of the pastor as the answer man.
Yes, the pastor is not the universal expert, but the pastor is, for most people within the congregation, the nearest person that they'll know to an expert. And so that is why he's important. That doesn't mean that it's very important that the pastor not present himself as a universal expert. Mm-hmm. Rather, he should be someone who is connected to a wider world. He doesn't have to be connected to all these experts, but connected to people who are connected to experts, and be someone who's well integrated into the world of the academy. He doesn't have to be in the academy himself, right, but he needs to be connected to people who are connected with that. He needs to be connected with people who are connected to the world of politics and business. And where those things are broken, it can be very easy to foster conspiracy theories, fads, and all these sorts of weird forms of crankish pseudo-scientific theories, diet fads, whatever it is. That's the context in which they grow, because people do not have contexts in which they're connected with the broader pool of knowledge and wisdom and expert dialogue, where people are actually testing ideas and they're able to discern at least this idea is nonsense and it can be dismissed. And also to recognize that these people in the academy is not an evil place where people are constantly trying to destroy the truth, and that's all that it's about. There's a lot of things that go on in the academy that are not good, but we can have a more reasonable approach to it and recognize much of this science is being done by people.
There's not just one academy, just as there's not just one.
Exactly. And so we're not ruled by a particular cabal of experts who all agree with each other. There's some sort of extreme consensus and a conspiracy among them to try and dominate us. It's not like that at all. There's all sorts of disagreement among experts. But again, that expert disagreement is not all going into their different ideological camps much of the time. Much of the time it's sharpening each other's opinions, changing their minds and developing their viewpoints. And it is actually one of the best ways to develop trust is to see a healthy academic context in action.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think what you're sketching there suggests that we need perhaps a very different model of theological education and pastoral formation than much of what we have now. And I guess I'll just throw in one plug here, that in many ways, what you're describing in terms of creating a network of knowledge in which the individual doesn't have to be an expert because he has a network of trust in which he can rely upon the collective wisdom of others. That's a lot of what we are seeking to do at the Davenant Institute, and provide that kind of community of knowledge and trust for pastors. So I think so that's a key thing, perhaps a long-term aspiration there. How can the church be perhaps better equipped next time around is to be working on forming pastors intellectually in the way where they can really provide epistemic leadership for their congregants. In the current moment, I think perhaps, one thing that pastors need to be doing is modeling humility. And I think, as I said, something I mentioned earlier is that, we live in an anti-authoritarian age, an age of reflexive skepticism, an age in which everyone tends to do what is right in their own eyes. And I think one important thing pastors can model right now is learning the humility of acknowledging, I don't know, I don't understand everything that's going on here. When I don't understand what's going on, this is coming back to something we talked about earlier. It's not blind. You don't want blind submission, but you do want humble respect of leaders that God has put there for a reason. God doesn't expect each of us to figure everything out, and so for that reason, He gives us those who are accountable to Him for figuring it out. It's not a blank check, right? They are accountable before God for not lording it over people unnecessarily, for not making foolish and rash judgments. And yet, for that reason, there's a certain, I think, and this is a lot of what the New Testament calls us to in its teaching on political authority. I think there's an important caveat to that New Testament teaching, to recognize that's addressed to people in a context who lack forms of political participation and engagement that we now have. But I think a lot of it still applies. And a lot of what Paul says in Romans 13 and what Peter says in 1 Peter 2 is, because we know that the political authorities are under judgment, that they are accountable to God, and because we know that there is way more to life than mere physical life. That living under political oppression it stinks, but as Jesus says, fear much more those who can throw body and soul into hell. As Christians, we should have a healthy sense of, as frustrating as unjust rule can be, there's a lot bigger problems out there, and those, they are accountable to God for their unjust rule, and so that gives us space for a certain degree of rest and peace and humility, in which we can say, I'm not sure if I understand what the decisions that are being taken. I'm not sure if I agree with the decisions that are being taken, but I can be thankful to God that the burden of those decisions does not lie with me, and that's something I think pastors can and should be modeling to their congregations at this time.
I think beyond that, just dealing with some of the emotions and the passions that arise at this sort of moment. People feel a lot of fear, and many people can panic. And actually, that sort of approach of putting on your own mask first, not necessarily in the literal sense, although that can help right now, but in the metaphorical sense of dealing with your own emotional state first, developing calm, developing a context where people feel that the problem is broken down to a reasonable size. And so it is a real problem, but at least we're not thinking it's the end of the world. And we're able to take steps one by one to actually develop some response to it. There, I think pastors have a deep impact upon their congregation in just setting the emotional tone. If the pastor is panicking, everyone else will panic. In the same way in the household, if the parents are panicking, the children will panic. And it's very important for pastors to set also a way of taking action and expanding and developing and exploring your realm of possibility. Because when we're faced with a huge crisis on a worldwide scale, it's easy to feel powerless. But there's a lot of things that we can do that lie immediately to our hands.
Right.
So first, explore that particular territory. Sort out those things that are in your immediate vicinity. And that will allow you a lot more calm to actually make a difference where you're standing. And I think much of what our obsession with the media and in speaking into those sorts of situations, it arises from our sense of powerlessness, that we can't act. But first of all, as Christians, we can act. We have access to a throne that's far higher and far greater than any earthly throne. We're seeing the limitations of human governments right now. The fact that when we sing the psalm Psalm 23, psalm of king, recognizing that he may be the shepherd of his people, but he needs to be shepherded
Right.
himself. He's not someone who has the ability to master all his ways. And in the same way, in our society, we need to pray for that for our leaders. And we feel our own lack of power, but that lack of power can be translated into a sense of dependence upon one who is sovereign in all of our affairs, human and in the affairs of the natural world. And in that situation, we can feel a lot less powerless, or at least the lack of power that we feel is not something that is attended with the degree of anxiety and the despair that it would be in a situation where we truly were powerless and we had no recourse. We do have recourse. And the other thing with that is recognizing the ways in which, in our own immediate contexts, we can take action and really make a difference within our communities. And churches, I think, are places where, first of all, communities come to light. There are very few institutions in our societies that actually represent a face of the community. The church is perhaps one of the best examples that remains. A community tends to be defined primarily by a geographic area, all the people who live in that, but there's no self-conscious presence of the community, except from political figures that represent us. But the church can be such a place. It can be a place where the local community that would feel like a lot of powerless individuals can start to come into an expression of communal action aimed at a common goal and a sense of being brought back together in the face of crisis. And there, I think, we have an awful lot to offer as churches and the communities that exist around our churches. So beyond that, I would also suggest...
I just add one concrete thing there that I think we need to really be facing is the church from the very beginning historically has been the place in which, as we had in Acts 3, no one treated anything as his own. And in time of emergency and famine and suffering, the members of the church who were blessed with financial security sacrificed for those who didn't have it. And I think there are what I see in many churches right now is people who are very loudly agitating the political authorities, but what about all of the economic harm that's being done? What about all those that are suffering with unemployment? And these are very legitimate concerns, but I think in some ways, and I don't want to impute motives to anyone, in some ways, loudly rattling on pounding on the door of the mayor or the governor can be a way of distracting ourselves from the duty that God has actually placed in front of us, which is, yes, your neighbor is out of a job, your neighbor is suffering economically, and it's going to be the task of the church to give sacrificially in this situation for those in the church who are blessed with secure employment, to be using those blessings to care for those who are not. So I mean, this is a good chance to the church to put its money where its mouth is, quite literally. I think that is, we are blessed. We are in prosperous societies. We're in wealthy societies. There is enough to go around. No one needs to be starving in the streets, but many of us will have to do without comforts that we take for granted. Give up vacations we were planning on taking, and not just because we can't travel now, but after this is all over, we may need to set aside those funds we had planned to spend traveling and use them to help those in need.
I think people can deal with crisis so much better when the basic existential needs are addressed. You've mentioned in the past the importance of recognizing meaning. If you have a reason for action, it's a lot easier to take action in a crisis and not to feel overwhelmed by what's taking place. People also need agency. And one of the things that is part of this crisis, a constitutive element, is the fact that people are being stripped of their means of agency. They're not being allowed to go out of their house. They're in a situation where their business that would allow them to be self-sufficient and support their family may go under. And in those sorts of situations, the church needs to be very mindful of how to give people, first of all, a sense of meaning. Why are we acting in the way that we are? Is there a common goal that we can work towards? And also a sense of how we can actually secure agency, that we're not just going to have to retreat to powerlessness and dependence. Because if we're doing that, there's something very wrong. We're losing some of the essential elements of human existence. And so we should actually address those discipline is the church.
Mm. Yeah, and I think a final thing to note is, we talked about how this has exposed the impatience of our society, that we feel like we've been, this has gone on forever, and unfortunately, it's going to go on for a lot longer. There's, some return to normal is going to be possible, but full return to normal is going to take a very long time. And I think the church should be in a better position than anyone else to speak to our very, attention deficit disorder society, and be able to see things in light of eternity, and teach the practice of patience, the practice of waiting, recognizing that the suffering that we are currently undergoing is nothing to be compared with the glory that awaits us. And if we can cultivate the calm that is willing to accept that, it's going to be a while before we can live the way that we're accustomed to living, that can be, I think, a powerful witness to a society around us that has nothing more to look forward to, and so can easily be paralyzed with fear.
And there, I think, even beyond the horizon of eternity, we are recognizing, first of all, nature is hitting us back in a way that it hasn't, or we may not have noticed it hitting back for a while. And history is coming back. This is something that is on a scale of, this seems to be greater than anything else we've experienced in our lifetimes. It's going to change things, and we're going to live differently. The international order is going to take a different shape after this. Our lifestyles are going to change. The relations in society, the manner in which we go about our daily life, the form of our work, all these things are probably going to shift. Maybe it's going to be just the acceleration of existing trends, or maybe it's going to be a swerve in another direction. But history is going on, and nature is still here with us. And in some ways, Christianity has, I mean, the church has gone through crises far worse than this. And the church has weathered these crises in Christ's name, and it's going to weather this one too. And as it does so, it has a historical and a natural awareness that it can give to the society that lacks it, where people are trapped in the immediacy of a spectacle and have never actually experienced what it is to reckon with the reality and the resistance and the friction of nature, or in terms of the progression of history and the way in which history throws curveballs at you.
Yes, yeah. Well, definitely a lot of lessons, I think, for the church to learn, and hopefully for the church to teach in this time. Thank you so much for taking the time to explore all of this with me.
Thank you.